New Testament textual variants that every Christian should know. The variant which best explains the others. Mark 16, 9-20. Welcome to New Testament textual variants that every Christian should know. This series exists because it is important for Christians to accurately understand their holy books. Last time, we talked about Luke 23:34a and how the principle of investigative authentication led us to reject that variant as inauthentic. Today, we will discuss the various endings of the Gospel of Mark and how the principle of causation allows us to determine which ending is correct. Now, causation is a shorthand way of referring to the idea that the variant which best explains the rise of the others is the one that is most likely to be the original reading. Further, this principle, causation, is an extension of the biblical principle of investigative authentication. That is, the Bible implicitly states that as long as at least 2 or 3 witnesses can be found in favor of a given claim, the matter cannot be decided by numbers of witnesses alone. Instead, the matter must be investigated. See Deuteronomy chapter 17 verses 2-7 and chapter 19 verses 15-21. In the case of something that requires a series of steps, one of the most effective ways to investigate it is to place those steps in order, to determine which step preceded a given step until there are no more steps left in the process. The step that stands at the head of the line is the one that caused all of the others and thus must be the original step. In the case of textual criticism, the steps that must be explained are textual variants, and textual critics must find the arrangements of the variants that best explains how each variant arose. In the case of the ending of the Gospel of Mark, this task is pretty complicated since there are 5 major variants and at least 10 minor variants that are at play. Number 1. The long ending is Mark 16, 9-20 as found in most traditional Bibles, like the KJV and the Geneva Bible. It is supported by the majority of manuscripts and possibly by sources as early as the Diatessaron, which comes from the 2nd century. Number 2. The elliptical ending stops at Mark 16:8, for they were afraid. This ending is supported by the following evidence. First, 3 Greek manuscripts, Sinaiticus Vaticanus and Minuscule 304, and several early translations, including about 100 Armenian manuscripts, end this way. Second, many manuscripts mark the long ending as dubious, including Family 1 and Minuscule 205. Further, many early church fathers show no knowledge of later verses, including Clement, Origen, Cyprian, and Cyril. Finally, both Eusebius and Jerome said that most of the Greek manuscripts present in their day did not contain additional verses beyond verse 8. Number 3. The short ending is found by itself in one Old Latin manuscript and in one Syriac manuscript, immediately after verse 8, and reads as follows. And all that had been commanded them, that is to the women, they told briefly to those with Peter, and afterward Jesus himself sent out through them, from the east as far as the west, the holy and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. Number 4. The long ending with the freer logion is found in manuscript W and is referenced in Jerome's writings. It is like the long ending, except that it contains an insertion after verse 14, called the freer logion. And they, that is the disciples, excuse themselves, saying, "This age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and the power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits." And Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual and imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven." Number 5. Finally, the short and long ending is composed of the short ending, mentioned previously, followed by the traditional long ending. It is supported by a number of manuscripts, including L. Psi, 083, 099, Minuscule 579, and Lectionary 1602. It is also sometimes found in early versions, including the Syriac and the Coptic. Now, our task will be to arrange these variants in different orders so as to find out which order makes the most sense. Before we do that, however, we need to lay some ground rules as well as establish a set of criteria by which to evaluate the proposed stemata, causality change. A text-critical stemma should adhere to these 2 ground rules. First, a stemma should not introduce new variants whenever possible. The reason for this is simple. Use of a historically unknown variant means that the stemma maker is rejecting the available evidence and is instead favoring conjecture. For example, some people have proposed that there was a pre-elliptical long ending of Mark that was lost at an early stage of transmission. As this pre-elliptical long ending doesn't actually exist, we don't have it, there is no point in including it in our stemata. Second, a stemma's steps should move by the smallest increments possible, unless the principle of decreased difficulty applies. For example, if one were to posit the step short ending to long ending, one would be implying that the short ending was erased and that the long ending was inserted in the same step. The reason why such a step is best avoided is that it ascribes more maliciousness to a given scribe that can necessarily be historically deduced. I'm going to go ahead and insert a comment at this point. This second ground rule here is actually a very important one that helps prevent a lot of bias. If you go by the smallest increment possible, what you're doing is you're basically staying away from either the mentality that everything is an error and everything is a corrupt, where you assume that everyone was getting things wrong, and it also helps you keep you away from the error of saying that whatever we have must automatically be correct and therefore nothing needs correction. That is, people on either side of the aisle when it comes to textual criticism tend to be conspiracy theorists. Either on the liberal side of things, you have people who are conspiracy theorists against Christianity, who basically propose that the Christians changed their own scriptures to teach things that they never believed before. You know, kind of the Dan Brown syndrome. And because all of these things, we can't be confident in the Bible at all. Or you have people on the other side of the aisle, the ultra-conservative textual scholars, who believe that everything that has that we're used to, that's come down to us by tradition, must automatically be correct, and therefore they will not allow there to be any other kind of correction. And these kind of folks on either side look at the various steps that are available, and they often choose large increments. The ones that are for the liberals, either the ones that are the most scandalous, that would show the Christian scribes in the worst possible light, or on the conservative side would show a particular set of scribes to be as heretical as possible. The problem with this, of course, is that the vast majority of scribes, by and large, were trying to do good work. They did not set out to make changes. They were not going out there to purposely corrupt Scripture, either heretically or to make it more orthodox than what they already understood them to be. And so if you go by the smallest increment possible, you will be avoiding falling into either pitfall. You'll be avoiding trying to assume too much about the scribes. And really it is a danger to assume too much about the scribes, because they lived, hundreds and even thousands of years ago. You can't exactly do a long-term, a distinct psychological analysis of them. And staying by the smallest increment possible helps avoid those kinds of errors from either falling into liberal scholarship where everything that's Christian is an error, or into ultra conservative scholarship where everything that we have must be correct and we couldn't possibly be corrected. Doing this helps you maintain the middle way of truth, as the ancient church fathers like to say. All right, moving on. As to evaluative criteria, stemata should be judged according to the following principles. First principle, fewer generations are preferred. People like stability, hence an ongoing process of change is unlikely. That is, if you propose a stemma that has 100 different generational steps in it, what you're saying is that for 100 generations of copies, people didn't have a fixed text, that they didn't decide on anything, and that it was just left in limbo for all that time. That is highly unlikely. People do not like constant change. They'll put up with a certain amount of change, but they do not like constant ongoing change. So rather than having a really long explanation, basically a short explanation is preferred, one that leads to stability more quickly. That's human nature. We like things to settle down as quickly as possible. Next principle, fewer splits are preferred. It is unlikely that if scribes were to have a problem with a particular reading, that they would respond to it in many ways rather than one particular way. This one actually goes along with the fewest generations possible principle. That is, you can take all the variants and you can squeeze them into one generation if you want. If you say that basically all of them came out of the same one basically at the same time, but then you would have to imply that basically the scribes are schizophrenic, that one time they do this thing and one time they do a different thing. But that isn't very likely. Typically, if there's a particular problem that people perceive, they'll usually respond to it in more or less the same way. Next principle, decreased difficulty is preferred. Barring mechanical, unintentional alterations, an intentional change is likely to be the result of a scribe who is trying to resolve some perceived difficulty. That is, the main intention of a scribe behind writing something down is that they wanted it to be read. They wanted it to be understood. And so if they change something, especially in an intentional change, not an accidental change like an error of sight or something like that, but an intentional change, it's going to be because they're trying to make it more readable, more understandable. Next principle. External explanation is preferred. The best stemata account for the reality of early witnesses and for popularity at the point of difference. That is, your stemma, once you create this causality chains, it has to be internally tight, have good reason inside of itself to believe it, but it also has to account for the external facts as well. So for example, if you propose that, if you come up with a stemma and your original variant for that stemma doesn't have early witness, and its earliest witness doesn't come until, like, say, the 12th century, well, then your stemma doesn't do a very good job of explaining the history that's around it. That is, if there are other variants that come sooner, and like, say, 3rd or 4th century, and yours doesn't come until the 12th, that you're trying to go for, well, then your stemma is going against what the history says. The history says that that is a late arrival. So that needs to be taken into account. And then there's also the point of difference. The point of difference is the point in history where people start recognizing that there are variants, that there are differences in the manuscripts, and at which they say what variant is most popular at that time. So basically, when they first start talking about differences, what was popular then? What was most common then? This doesn't apply to every variant. Not all variants get mentioned in history, which ones are more popular than others, or even that a variant is involved. Sometimes people don't actually notice that a variant is there, even though you can see it in the manuscripts. But with certain manuscripts, you do have this, where it is talked about in history that there, where people recognize that there are different variants. And at that time, they talk about what is most common up to the time where they've noticed the difference. Whatever variant was most common at the point of difference is the one that had been established up to that point. And because of that, that is a critical variant. and is to be preferred over others. All right. Now that we've set up the ground rules, and since we've established some criteria by which to evaluate these things, we will move on to the stemata. And we're going to start with the least likely. This is the least likely stemma that is possible, and this one starts with the short and long ending together. Okay, and we're following the principle of smallest increment. So what variants do we have that are closest to the shortest and to the short and long ending together? Well, that would be the short ending and the long ending. And also you see here that we're not introducing any extra nodes. We have 5 total major variants for the long ending of mark, and that's all of the nodes that we have here. It's just those 5. We're not introducing any extras. So the ones that would be closest to the short and long ending would be the short and long ending separately. And then closest to the long ending would be the longer ending and the freer logion. And then closest to the short ending would be the elliptical ending. So that's the stemma. Now we need to go through and evaluate just how good or bad this one is. And like I said, this one is the worst one. So let's take a look at our first principle. That is the principle of generations. We want as few generations to be possible as possible. And this one actually does pretty good that way. This one only has 2 generations after the original. Now we're going to list those as being negative. So we're going to count it against the stemma, because every generation that you go forward is against it. What we would prefer to have is just the original with no variance whatsoever. That would be preferred. So anything that's beyond that is something that requires explanation, something that counts against the stemma. But this one still doesn't have that many compared to others. Only 2 generations isn't that bad. Other thing that we talked about is the splits. When you have a scribe looking at a particular manuscript, are they going to treat it in the same way or different ways? If you treat it in different ways, you're being a little bit schizophrenic. That's a bit of a problem. This stemma does have one split in it that is problematic. That is, with the short and long ending, we have some scribes doing the short ending and some scribes taking out the long ending. So we have one previous that gets split into 2. Okay, so that is a bit of a problem. And then when it comes to difficulty, we get all kinds of problems with this one. If you have the short and long ending, the very first problem that you have is the fact that you're starting with the short and long ending. That is, you'd ask the question, why on earth would Mark originally write 2 endings to his gospel? It doesn't make sense. Now, granted, it's possible that he could have written 2 in the grand scheme of hypotheticalness, but it is not terribly likely. Most of the time when people finish any kind of a work, they only include one ending. It doesn't make sense for 2 different endings to be inserted by the original author. That's a difficulty. And then in the first generation, we also have difficulty as well. That is, if you have a scribe who has a text that has the short and long ending in it, yeah, I can understand where the scribe might say, well, 2 endings seems a little weird, and so they would pick one or the other, but you still wind up with problems with either one. For example, if you have a text that has both the short and the long ending together in it, why would you pick just the short ending? That is, the long ending has the greater detail. And most of the scribes that we look through, when we look through their tendencies, they like to include more detail. Why? Because they wanted the readers to have increased understanding, not minimal understanding. And so they would usually add more detail, and this is something that we see in a lot of manuscripts. One of the best examples of this is Codex D, Codex Bezae, which has lots of extra little historical tidbits in there, a lot of them coming from a tradition that had been passed down orally about these different things, and it all got included in this particular manuscript. So much so that, for example, the Book of Acts in Codex Bezae is like something between 8 and 20% longer than it is in most other variants. Why? Because they wanted to include all of this extra material to make sure that people had the fullest understanding of this thing possible. That was the scribal tendency. So why someone would choose the short ending intentionally is definitely problematic, given that a longer, fuller ending is possible. But even if we say maybe it was unintentional, maybe the long ending happened to be on the next page of the manuscript, of the original manuscript that the scribe was dealing with, and that last page got lost. That's a possibility, but it's not a very likely one. And the reason why is that, first of all, you'd have to propose that it broke exactly, and that it came onto the next page exactly after the ending, after the short ending, which would be kind of a strange coincidence in the first place. But the bigger problem that you have is that these scribes made their text to be used. And if you have a major omission, people who are using this thing are going to notice that major omission, and they're going to correct it. And this is something that we see in manuscripts. There are manuscripts where major omissions did occur. One of the most classic examples is Codex Sinaiticus in the Book of Job. In the Book of Job, around chapter 16, I believe it is, nearly an entire chapter gets left out. It looks like, as best as we can tell, the scribe who was originally copying it basically was working with loose leaves, and one of the leaves had either gotten reshuffled or lost. And so there's an entire chapter, almost an entire chapter of the Book of Job that gets skipped initially. But of course, Codex Sinaiticus, like all other codices, like all other manuscripts, was made to be used, and so people in using it noticed that it was missing, and they put it into the margin. Okay, any major variant that is there gets corrected in the manuscripts. That's what we see. There are major omissions that happen, but every single example that we have, aside from this one, it gets corrected. Every single time in the manuscripts that we see where a major omission has taken place, it gets corrected in that manuscript. So proposing that it just become lost because either it's on the next page, or maybe the exemplar that they had simply had got it, whatever the case happens to be, you're saying that it didn't get caught, which is highly unlikely. And then we also have problems with going to the longer ending. You see, in the manuscripts that have the short and the longer ending together, the short ending is first. So you basically have to take out material from the middle. And like I said, sometimes omissions do happen, but the larger the omission, first of all, the less likely it is to happen, and the more likely it is to get caught. So it isn't very likely on accidental grounds, on mechanical grounds, and then intentionally, if you have someone who's saying, okay, I have two endings, need to get rid of one of them because it doesn't make sense to have two, the way that they split it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That is, the short ending actually does pick up from verse 8. Verse 8 in Mark chapter 16 is talking about the women who had been at the tomb who saw the angel at the tomb. And the short ending picks up from there. The long ending, however, doesn't. It actually switches subjects. It goes actually back to Jesus on the day that he rose and has him having a conversation with Mary Magdalene, which is the same thing we find in the Gospel of John. But in the Gospel of John, it's all one narrative. In the long ending of Mark, though, it basically restarts the story of Jesus' resurrection. That is, it would have made a lot more sense to have the first part of the short ending still there so that you maintain the same subject, and then transition over to the part about Mary Magdalene. But that's not what's done. So either way you look at it, it is still a difficulty. And then in the second generation, we have another difficulty, and that is the elliptical ending. That is, if you have the short ending, why would you trade the short ending for basically a non-ending? Because that's what the elliptical ending is. It's basically a non-ending. Why would you do that? Well, intentionally, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's nothing that's in the short ending that's really all that objectionable. It's just a very brief summary of what we know from the other Gospels. There's not really much that would be objectionable there that you would intentionally take out. So the only other option is that it was accidentally left out, but then again, it's a fairly large section, and it's a fairly obvious thing. It'd be highly unlikely that this would be caught, that this wouldn't be caught within that manuscript itself where it first happened. Okay. So these four are all very difficult to explain. You can come up with explanations for them, but they're just not very likely. That being said, though, the long ending and the freer log end, that actually does make a decent amount of sense. That is, if you have the long ending and you have And you looking at verse 14 in the longer ending, it talks about Jesus rebuking the disciples for their unbelief, but it doesn't give any details. It's very easy to see how some scribe would have either wanted to fill in the details, or how a scribe could have seen perhaps a marginal note that talked about it from tradition, because there's lots of things that the early scribes had access to that came from tradition, not necessarily that those traditions were accurate, but simply that they did put a lot of stock in tradition. How they could have taken something from tradition and put it into the text by means of explanation, because that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to provide their readers with the most detail possible to increase their understanding. So that one actually does make sense. The others, not so much. So in the net effect, when we assess the difficulty of it, we have 5 different nodes here. 4 of them present more difficulty than not. Only one of them is basically going in the direction that we would expect it to go, for a net result of -3. So when it comes to the internal evidence within the stemma itself, we get a total of -6 points. 6 things that we could point to that would be against the stemma being authentic. And like I said, this is the worst possible case. This is the worst stemma, the worst initial variant to choose. And so this would be -6 out of 6 for a perfect -1.0. Worst possible case is what this one is for this particular point of variation. Of course, that's the internal evidence. Like I said, though, a good stemma has to be able to account for the external evidence as well. So let's look at the issue of early witness. Okay, one of the earliest witnesses that we have for the short and long ending together comes from a 4th century Coptic manuscript. Okay, and so that's what the 4th century right here part is representing. Okay, and then the rest of the calculation that's here is basically something that normalizes it. That is, this main variant shows up in the 4th century. Now, the earliest evidence that we have for any of these endings in history comes from the 2nd century, and then to normalize it, we recognize that it was a document that was written in the 1st century. So our variant comes from the 4th century, the earliest evidence possible is the 2nd century, and how far away is the original manuscript from that earliest evidence at this point of variation? We're at least 1 century out. So that gives us 2 units away from where we want to be, 2 units in the wrong direction, -2. And then there's also the issue of the point of difference. That is, when the point of difference is mentioned in history, where people start noticing a difference and they talk about what's been popular up to that time, the short plus long ending is not the one that's listed as popular. In fact, it isn't even mentioned. You have both Eusebius and Jerome that are part of that point of difference that talk about it, that talk about the fact that they're starting to see other manuscripts at this point, but they do not even mention the short and long ending. So when it comes to the external evidence, there are 3 points against it, and this is the most that we ever see in any of these. So it's -3 out of 3, again, a perfect -1.0, for a grand total of -2, -2.0. Worst possible case is starting with the short and long ending. Okay, so if anyone tells you that having the short and long ending together was the original, they don't know what they're talking about, quite frankly. That is literally the worst scenario that is possible. Let's move on to one that's a little bit better. The long ending and the freer login. Now, as you see here, we're following the ground rules. We only have 5 nodes total, which is all that we're allowed to have as per the ground rules, and we're also moving by the smallest increment possible. What's the next smallest increment from the long ending plus the freer login? It would just be the long ending. After the long ending, we can't jump straight to the short ending because we have to remove material first. So we have to do the removal first and then get up to the short ending. And then finally, once we have both the long ending and the short ending in existence, then we can say that the short and long ending were put together. So this one requires many generations to get through it. In fact, it requires 4 different generations. So generation assessment, -4, quite a bit. And you'll also notice that there is one split. That is how we deal with the long ending. It's dealt with in 2 different ways. either it becomes the elliptical ending or it gets combined with the short ending. So two different ways. There's a split there. We want to minimize those splits as much as possible, so we're going to count that split against it. But in terms of difficulty, this stemma is actually quite a bit better than the last one. That is, there are only two parts of the stemma that are difficult to explain. That is, going from the long ending and the freer log end down to just the long ending does present a difficulty. The freer log end is a substantial portion of text, so if it was mechanically missed, it's very likely that it would have been noticed and corrected. That is, omissions do occur, accidental omissions do occur in the manuscript history, but when they involve a substantial portion of text, every single instance that we have in a manuscript shows that it gets noticed and corrected. So that isn't terribly likely. And then we also have the problem of going from the long ending to the elliptical ending. Yes, that is the smallest increment possible, so it's good in that regard, but it's still difficult to explain why intentionally someone would go from having an ending to a non-ending. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, some people have proposed, that the long ending had, objectionable material in it. Mark 16:18 talks about picking up snakes and drinking poison, and we don't want to encourage people to do that, so we'll take it out. This is something that I hear from conservative, not just conservative, but ultra-conservative textual scholars fairly frequently. They think that there are some heretical scribes who, down in Alexandria somewhere, who just wanted to take it out. So they went and they excised it. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If they were objecting to something in the text like that, like Mark 16:18, then why not just take out that part that they're objecting to? Okay, did they literally find objectionable material in everything from verse 9 down to verse 20, which is a lot of it is material that coincides with material that's found in other Gospels and Book of Acts, but they didn't excise that material there. It doesn't make sense. There's no consistent reason why they would intentionally want to leave stuff out. And then the only other explanation you have is if it wasn't intentional, if there isn't some mechanical reason for why it'd be left out, which would still be unlikely because it's a fairly large variance. You'd think that the person that this is made for would notice this, and that the people who are reading this would notice this. That's how it always works out in these things. In every manuscript that we have an example of, any sizable omission gets noticed. But even if you can't posit a mechanical reason for us, or an intentional reason for us, you still have the problem of, perhaps, like I said, the long ending could have been on the next page and the last page got lost, but it would still be noticed. You could have, some people have proposed that, maybe the person who made this manuscript coming from the long ending, maybe they were copying from a lectionary manuscript. And the lectionaries are interesting because they actually divide out Mark. Actually, the lectionaries divide out everything, but they divide out Mark exactly where the difference between the elliptical ending and the long ending is. That is, in one place over here in the lectionaries and in the liturgical readings, you'll have a section of Mark going through verse 8, and then in a completely different section you'll have parts that go from 9 to 20. Both of them were part of the liturgy, but they were in different places. So some people have proposed that, well, maybe somebody was making their copy of Mark from the lectionaries, and they got this part, but they basically forgot the other part that would have been in the lectionary. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because scribes who would have had access to lectionaries would have known what they were. Liturgies were very common in the church, and scribes who dealt with them knew exactly what they were. They knew that they were out of order because they were arranged for readings in the churches and things like that. They knew that they oftentimes were not complete. And so we have no solid evidence that a lectionary was ever used as a basis for a continuous manuscript. Now, we do know that because of errors of memory, some readings from lectionaries did find their way into continuous manuscripts. That is just because the scribes had memorized it the way that it was in the lectionary and put it in that way. But as far as actually sitting down with a lectionary and trying to turn a lectionary into a continuous manuscript. We don't have any evidence of that. So it's not entirely impossible, but it is very hard to explain. It's very difficult. So those two are still very difficult, but the other three are not so bad. That is, there is not necessarily an innate reason why Mark couldn't have started with the long ending and the freer logion. That is, if you have the elliptical, if you have the elliptical ending that just ends rather abruptly, you can understand why a scribe would want to provide some kind of short little explanation of it. That's relatively easy to explain. That's not very difficult. And also why a scribe who has access to both the long ending and the short ending, in order to make sure that he didn't lose any material, would combine them. That is, if he's not sure which one is the true one, he'll put both of them into his manuscript to make sure that the original isn't lost. He'll preserve both just to make sure that the original is preserved. And we do see that in various manuscripts where different readings will be present and they'll be conflated into one reading just on the offhand that one or that either of them could be correct. So 2 are difficult, 3 are not. Gives us positive 1 when it comes to the difficulty. Overall, when it comes to the internal evidence for the stemma, we get a score of -4. It's not as bad as the last one. The last one was 6. So it's -4 out of 6, giving us a resultant internal score of -0.67. Let's look at external evidence, though. The earliest external evidence that we have for the freer logion comes from Jerome and I think manuscript W, which both could at the earliest be pushed to the 4th century, possibly 5th century, but we'll be generous and say 4th. And so you find out what that would be normalized, how many units away from the earliest evidence that we have, given how far the manuscript, the original, is from its earliest evidence, and it's -2 units, same as the last one. And then again, this one is not the one that is mentioned as being the most popular at the point of difference. Yes, Jerome does talk about the differences, but he does not list this reading as being the one that was most common at that point. So that stands against it. For -3 external points against it out of 3 for -1.0 for external evidence. Combine those and you get -1.7. Alright, so short ending and long ending together, not very likely. Long ending and freer logion together, not very likely. But let's keep moving on. Now, one fairly intriguing initial point is the short ending. Let's say that Mark started with the short ending. What would that look like? Well, we need to make sure that we don't have any more nodes that are necessary. You'll notice there are only 5 here. And also we need to go by the smallest increment possible. Smallest increment next to the short ending is the elliptical ending to long ending, and then long ending to the longer ending and the freer logion. And then the short and long ending comes from the short and long being combined. Okay, so that's the stemma. Now let's go ahead and evaluate it. In terms of generations, it does a little bit better than the last one. The last one had 4 generations. This one only has 3. So that's a little bit of an improvement. But it does have 2 splits. That is, the short ending is becoming the elliptical ending, and the short ending is being combined with the long ending. So there's an extra split there. And then there's also the long ending getting combined with the freer logion, and the long ending getting combined with the short. So the long ending is split, and the short ending gets split. Now, in terms of difficulty, though, there's only one of these steps that is really difficult, and that is going from the short ending to the elliptical ending. Now, you have to put in the elliptical ending in there somewhere, and if you're starting with the short ending, you're going to wind up having to make that transition somewhere. Might as well put it here, but it's still difficult. If you're doing it intentionally, why would you go from having an ending to a non-ending? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If it's accidental, why didn't it get noticed and corrected? Because like I said, substantial omissions always get noticed in the manuscript itself and corrected in the manuscript itself. That's all the evidence that we have. Why didn't that happen here? That's very difficult to explain. The other ones, though, are not so bad. It's conceivable that Mark could have written his his gospel with a short ending. And if you have the elliptical ending, it's understandable why somebody would want to fill in the details and why they might go through the other material that they have in the Bible and basically compose an ending from those that would match those. That would make sense. And why someone who has access to a tradition about the specific rebuke that happens in 1614 would actually go ahead and include that rebuke. That makes sense. And then also it makes sense that someone who has both access to the short ending and the long ending would conflate them together so as to not lose anything. That all makes sense, except for the elliptical ending. So as far as difficulty, this one actually does really good. One that's fairly difficult, four that are not, for a net difference of positive 3. That significantly improves the internal score of this one. This one's internal score is only negative 2 out of 6, or negative 0.33. As far as the internal grounds are concerned, this one does much better than the other ones did. But we still need to make sure that the stemma matches the external evidence, and that is where this one falls flat. That is, the earliest witness that we have to just the short ending by itself is from an Old Latin manuscript. The Old Latin manuscripts are called Itala. That's what the ITA stands for. It's an Old Latin manuscript, and it dates to about the 4th century at the earliest, possibly into the 5th century, but we'll be generous and say 4th century. And again, that is 2 units, 2 standardized units away from the earliest evidence. So that's a problem. And then again, at the point of difference where people start talking about differences being there, they don't say that this is the one that was most popular at that time. In fact, they don't even mention the short ending, neither Eusebius nor Jerome. So that's a problem. So when it comes to external evidence, again, it's negative 3 out of 3, negative 1.0. It's as bad as it can be. So combine those, you get negative 1.3 when you round it off. So it is better than the other two, but it's still not anywhere near great. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at the long ending. The long ending is one that lots of people have preferred, and certainly through history it's the one that's been preferred. It's the one that you find in the vast majority of manuscripts, and there's lots of people today that still like the long ending, and frankly not for a terrible reason. The long ending is easily better than anything that we've seen so far. Okay, but if we start with the long ending, this is the stemma that comes from it. We want to make sure that all of our steps are as small as possible. Okay, and also we want to make sure that we don't have any excess nodes. And you'll see here we only have 5 nodes total. And also we've tried our best to make sure that our steps are as small as possible. So from the long ending, we go to the long ending to having the freer logon with it. That's a short step. And we can't go all the way to the short ending because we have to erase material first. So we have to erase the material first. There's the elliptical ending. And then we can get to the short ending. And once both the long ending and short ending are in existence, then you get the poor scribes who have to deal with both of them and just combine both of them to be safe. Okay, so that's the stemma. Let's evaluate it. First evaluation in terms of generations, it doesn't do terrible. 3 generations. It's not the worst possible, it's not the best possible, it's kind of middle of the road. But 3 generations is not bad. In terms of splits, it does have a couple of splits coming off from the long ending. If you make the long ending the primary one, you wind up doing lots of different things with it, and so that is a little bit of a problem. The long ending gets used to be combined with the freer logon, and it also gets combined with the short ending. There's a lot that's happening with it. That's 2 extra splits than would minimally be necessary if everything was in a row, and so that is a little bit of a problem. So you need to account for that. You need to realize that. And when it comes to difficulty, just like with the last one, there really is only one major point of difficulty, and that is the elliptical ending. If you say that the elliptical ending was created intentionally, you wind up with some major inconsistencies. There really is no good reason for it to be made intentionally. Why would someone who has a sufficient ending get rid of it? Also, if it was because there was objectionable material in the long ending, why didn't they remove just the objectionable material and leave the other things? Okay, if you're going to posit a mechanical reason, you also have to posit that it wasn't corrected. when it was made. But like I said, from every manuscript that we have that has a sizable omission in it, it gets corrected in the manuscript itself. So that doesn't really work either. That is still a point of difficulty. The others are not so bad, though. Like I said, somebody wanting to expand on verse 14 and explain what was going on there when Jesus talks about rebuking the disciples. What did the disciples say? What did Jesus say? That makes sense. We see that in other manuscripts. That's normal. If you have the elliptical ending just by itself, it's no surprise that a scribe who wants to make this text presentable to the reader and wants to make the text understandable to the reader would put some kind of a summary reading on it. That makes sense. And then also it makes sense that a scribe who has both the long ending and the short ending would conflate them so as to not lose anything, just on the off chance that either one could be right. So when it comes to internal evidence, again, the long ending does pretty good, just like the short ending did. It's only -2 out of 6, negative 0.33 in the final analysis. That's pretty good for internal evidence. Okay. Well, internally, there is actually a lot of reason to like the long ending. And also when it comes to the external information, there's also a lot of reason to like it there, particularly when it comes to the issue of the early witness. That is, the long ending at least appears to show up in early documents like the Diatessaron or in early church fathers like Irenaeus, for example. Some people have posited that Justin Martyr perhaps referenced the long ending as well, but that's a little bit tenuous. That is, the section that he references only has 5 words that are actually in common with the long ending, and they're in a different order, so it's much more likely that he was just summarizing something else or making a general statement. It's much harder to propose that it actually was the long ending, just because very few words actually correspond. It's just 5 out of basically an entire sentence, which is not great. But still, there are early references that at least appear that way, and even if not all of them are actually quotations of the long ending, odds are that at least one of them are, and there's quite a few that come from the 2nd century that you could point to. Like I said, there's at least the Diatessaron, Irenaeus, and Justin Martyr that have at least been given that attribution. Like I said, there's a problem with Justin Martyr because he just gets 5 words out of the long ending, and they're in a different order. There is a problem with Irenaeus' quotation in that he originally wrote in the 2nd century in Greek, and the version that we have for Irenaeus is from the Latin, and that Latin translation was probably done 3rd or 4th century. And so it's possible that that change could have happened at the translation rather than the original, so there's problems there. Diatessaron is a compilation of the different Gospels. It's a Gospel harmony, so it's possible that the material that looks like it could have come from Mark could have actually come from somewhere else. There are problems with all of them, but still, you expect that at least one of them would probably be authentic. It's not unreasonable to say that the long ending does actually go back to the 2nd century. And if in fact it does go back to the 2nd century, like I said, at least one of those 3 probably is a true 2nd century reference. And then, well, that's as early as the evidence that we have for this particular variant. It goes back to the 2nd century. And so that is as close as it can possibly be at 0 units away from that point. But there is still one thing that counts against it. When it comes to the point of difference, yes, the long ending is known, but it is not the one that is said to be the most common at the point of difference. It isn't the popular reading at that point. That is, when we get to the point of difference in history with Eusebius and Jerome, both of them are consistent in saying that the most common Greek manuscripts do not have the long ending. It's not the one that's common at the point of difference, so that counts against it. So it gets -1 out of 3 possible for external evidence, so -0.33. That's still better than anything that we've had before. Most of the others come from, 4th century, or come from about the 4th century or later, and so this one is still, leaps and bounds ahead of that, but it still isn't the one that's listed as being positive at the point of difference, so that's a bit of an issue. You combine those internal and external scores, both the internal and the external, and you get a combined score of -0.67. This is the first one that we've had that actually broke the 1 unit threshold. The others were, -1.3, -1.7, -2. This is the first one that we've got that's below that threshold of, or I should say higher than that threshold of -1. So there is a lot of good reason why people in the past and in the present have preferred the long ending. There is a lot that commends it. It's certainly better than anything that we've seen before, far and away. But there's still one ending left, one more stemma that we need to go through, and it turns out that it is actually better. But the long ending is still a close second contender. What is this final ending that we need to consider being the original? It's the elliptical ending. The elliptical ending has given us fits throughout all of this, because we always have to explain why you would go to the elliptical ending from having some other ending. It's always a problem, and it's not going to be any less of a problem here that way. But what's interesting is that if you start with the elliptical ending and you follow that principle of going by the shortest path possible, the shortest increment possible, and you don't have any extra nodes or anything like that, it actually turns out that its internal evidence is actually slightly better than that for the long ending. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Let's first look at generations. This stemma only requires 2 generations, okay, whereas the long ending requires at least 3. So that's a benefit. Also, this one does have 2 splits. Okay, I believe the long ending only had 1. Let me go ahead and just go right back to that. Oh, sorry, the long ending had 2. Okay, so it's the same as the long ending on that one. 2 generations and 2 splits. Okay, so it's about on equal ground there, so we've gotten rid of a generation. That helps, kept the same number of splits. So it's in the same terms there. And in terms of difficulty, there's only one part of the stemma that's really difficult, and that is the elliptical ending itself. That is just at the beginning of the stemma where we had the short and the long ending together, and we're asking why would Mark start with 2 endings? This one we also have a problem with where it starts. That is, why would Mark start with basically a non-ending? That is not something that we would expect. That is very difficult to explain. That being said, it's actually not quite as difficult as some people would imagine. That is, a lot of people would say, well, if there's a non-ending there, an elliptical ending there, that obviously has to be wrong because people don't end books that way. Well, that's not true. There are books that have non-endings. There are things that have non-endings, and you've probably actually seen a few of them in movie form. You've seen movies that had non-endings. You were probably annoyed by them, but you've seen them. Non-endings do happen, and people will say, well, that's kind of a modern thing. That's people being fancy in the modern age. That's certainly not ancient. It certainly isn't something that we'd expect to see in the Bible. Well, that's not actually true either. In the Bible, we actually do have another book that has an elliptical ending. It's called the Book of Jonah. Jonah actually ends with an elliptical ending. It has God rebuking Jonah for being more concerned about a dead plant than for a city that was filled with people and cattle to boot. And then it stops. There is no resolution. There is no what did Jonah learn. There is nothing beyond that. It just stops there. It's an elliptical ending. So to say that elliptical endings didn't happen in ancient writing and that they're not biblical simply isn't true. They did happen. However, they are still rare. And because even though it's well within the realm of possibility, as proved by the Book of Jonah, it is still a very rare occurrence. That is, in the Old Testament, there are 39 books. Only one of them has a definitely elliptical ending. And so it's still a very rare thing, so we need to say that that is definitely difficult. The other ones, though, there are no great difficulties there. That is, if you have a scribe who has the elliptical ending to go with, you can see where he would be a little bit concerned and he'd want to provide some kind of a summary. Or where he might want to do more than just a summary, where he might actually want to flesh this out and actually make it match the other endings that you see in the other Gospels, flesh it out and give the full detail there. He wouldn't want to be necessarily altering the Bible or anything like that, but he'd want to provide endings that would be based on that. That's what we see with the long ending. The long ending of the Gospel of Mark has many places that coincide with the other Gospels and with the book of Acts. Lots of crossover material there. The person who put together the long ending wasn't setting out to do something that was contrary to the Bible. He was setting out to complete this book that he thought was unfinished because it looks unfinished. It's an elliptical ending with material that he knew was biblical, that to the best of his knowledge was accurate. Either way, either a short summary statement of basically what he knows about the gospel or going in more detail. Okay, it's very possible to see why a scribe who's concerned about the elliptical ending would want to do either of those two. And then, again, if you have a scribe who has both access to the short ending and the long ending after they've been made, and he's not sure which one to go with, why he might decide to include both of them just to be on the safe side. That happens in the manuscripts where you have two competing readings in different manuscripts, and in other manuscripts you see them conflated together, lest you should lose something that's important. And then again, if you have material from tradition, or perhaps someone's wishful thinking, but someone wanting to explain why in verse 14 you have Jesus rebuking the disciples, give more explanation about it, give more detail why they would include the freer login on it. Okay, so all of those are going in the direction of decreased difficulty. That is, you have the scribe trying to decrease the difficulty for the reader, trying to make it more suitable for the reader, more understandable for the reader, trying to give the reader more detail. All of those are going in the right direction, except for the first one, but it's not an impossible reading. Like I said, Jonah has an elliptical ending as well, but it's still very rare, and because of that, it's still more difficult than any of the alternatives would be, except for the short ending plus the long ending. There's really no good reason why Mark would start with two endings, or why Mark would have a non-ending. But when you do all of this out, the internal evidence actually does turn out better. That is, it's just -1 out of 6, whereas the long ending had -2 out of 6. Just a little bit better, but it's still better, for a final internal score of -0.17. Okay, but there's not just the internal evidence that needs to be considered. You also need to consider the external evidence. Okay, let's talk about early witnesses. The earliest witness that we have to the elliptical ending is Clement. Clement is a 2nd and 3rd century church father. He was alive in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and he doesn't show any knowledge of verses beyond verse 8. Okay, so he's alive in the 2nd century. His knowledge of the text probably comes out of the 2nd century, so you can easily put it there. That's the earliest evidence that we have for any of these variants, so it's as close as it could possibly be, 0 units away. Now, some people don't necessarily like using Clement as a basis for this argument, because this is basically an argument for silence. That is, you're saying that this person didn't mention this thing, and therefore they're a positive witness for you, which is always a trouble when you're trying to establish that something wasn't talked about in history. Because the reason why they didn't talk about it could have been because they didn't have it, or also could have been because they simply didn't get around to talking about it. For example, a lot of the church fathers never mention Obadiah, for example. That doesn't mean that Obadiah wasn't in the Bible, though, just because early church fathers didn't mention it. And so it's important to recognize that using Clement in this way is a little bit tenuous, and which is why a lot of scholars who aren't so comfortable with using Clement would use Codex Vaticanus. Now, Codex Vaticanus, pretty much everyone would know is a fourth, well, anyone who's in textual scholarship, I should say, New Testament textual scholarship, would know that Codex Vaticanus is actually a 4th century manuscript. So why wouldn't you put a 4 here instead of a 2 for the 2nd century? Well, the reason for that is that Codex Vaticanus has been compared to 2nd and 3rd century manuscripts, and it's actually found to coincide with them very well. Yes, it's a 4th century manuscript, but its base text is actually the same as these early manuscripts. It's basically the same text form. Like, for example, P75 is a late 2nd century, early 3rd century manuscript, and it actually has some of the unique readings that Codex Vaticanus has. That is, P75 and Codex Vaticanus have readings that are unique, that are alone. That is, they form a textual chain that is independent of all the other textual chains that easily goes back to the 2nd century or beyond. So when textual scholars, New Testament textual scholars, come to readings that they don't have, 2nd and 3rd century manuscripts for, just because the manuscripts might not be extant for that particular portion. A lot of times they'll go back to Vaticanus because they know that the text form in Vaticanus goes back to at least the 2nd century. So Vaticanus, even though it's a 4th century manuscript, we know that its text form is earlier than that. Another example of a manuscript that is like that, it doesn't go back to the 2nd century, but another manuscript that functions the same way is 1739. 1739 is a medieval manuscript, but you can compare it to earlier manuscripts like, say, B and also P45 and other early manuscripts, and you actually find out that it was based on a 4th century manuscript. So yes, it itself is a medieval manuscript, it's a late manuscript, but it has a virtually identical text form to those that are from the 4th century. So it was based on a 4th century exemplar. And so 1739, even though it's later, is often used as a reference because we know that its base text is much earlier. And that's the same thing that happens with Vaticanus. Yes, technically Vaticanus is a 4th century manuscript, but we know that its text form goes back to the 2nd century. And so it would count as a 2nd century witness as well. So either Clement or Codex Vaticanus actually work here. If you're not comfortable with the argument from silence in Clement, you can use Codex Vaticanus. Either way, you can definitely find evidence for the elliptical ending going back to the 2nd century. And another thing that the elliptical ending has going for it is that it is the one that is actually mentioned as being the most common at the point of difference. When we look at both Eusebius and Jerome, who are the first people to talk about there being different readings at this point in any substance, and also the first ones to mention what was popular at their day, they say that the elliptical ending was the most common, that the majority of Greek New Testament manuscripts that they had available to them ended at what would be verse 8 for us. They didn't break it up into verses, but we do. It ended there. And so when it comes to external evidence, it's actually a positive 1 out of 3. So positive 0.33, combining both the internal and the external, we get a combined score of positive 0.17. Okay, by the way, this negative 0.17 is 0.16 repeating. This is 0.3 repeating, so if you do it out and round it, then it comes to the 0.17, just in case some of you think I forgot how to do math. I'm recognizing that these are repeating decimals and then basing it on that. Okay, just this is rounded. Okay, and it's based on what it actually is, but that's neither here nor there. The point, though, is that this one is actually turned out to be the best out of all the others, but another thing that's important to recognize is that this is the only one that in its combined score actually comes out positive. None of the others do. That is, with all of the others, we've had varying levels of reason not to accept them. This is the only one that has a reason to accept it. So, as to how confident we can be that the elliptical ending is the correct reading to Mark's Gospel, the fact that it is the variant which best explains the others should be sufficient. Out of all of the variants that we've looked at, it is the one that comes out on top. It is also the only one that positively satisfies the principle of causation. Like I said, all of the others, you have varying levels of reason not to believe them. This is the only one where you have a positive reason to believe it. But nonetheless, it is worthwhile noting the fact that the UBS 5, the United Bible Society's 5th edition of the Greek New Testament, gives this reading an A level of confidence. And that many believing textual scholars such as Daniel Wallace, James White, and Philip Comfort have likewise concluded that the elliptical ending is easily the best extant candidate for the original ending of this gospel. Okay, so we've done the work ourselves. It's the one that best explains the others. That's good. But not only that, it's positive. It's the only one that's positive. Even better. When we look at work that other people have done, they give this one an A level of confidence. Out of all of the extant readings that are there, this one is easily the one that is the best candidate. And not just by a little margin. Okay, the UBS 5 will rate things as either A, B, C, D, or all the way down to diamond is basically their signal that they use where we really couldn't make a decision here. They don't list it as any of those. They list it as the A at the highest level of confidence that they can. That's how certain they are that this variance is the right one, that the elliptical ending that ends in verse 8 is correct. And of course, it's not just some of the major resources like the United Bible Society's 5th edition. You also have a lot of other textual scholars who haven't been involved in that project who have come to the same conclusion, like Daniel Wallace and James White and Philip Comfort. Now, as to how the traditional long ending, because that's the most popular one, as to how that traditional long ending came about, we note that Mark 16:9 through 20 is largely a mashup of portions of other New Testament books. You can see Comfort. There's a resource sheet that I'll put at the last slide here, and it will have the information. And you look at pages 202 through 203 of his book, and he goes through verse by verse, and he lists where all the crossovers are. That is, as far as we can tell, it looks like somebody made the long ending by basically putting together pieces from other Gospels and the book of Acts, for the most part. And that's basically where it comes from as far as we can tell. But more specifically, and perhaps more interestingly, is the fact that one Armenian manuscript, and it's a medieval manuscript, but there's one Armenian manuscript that actually claims that a fellow by the name of Aristion composed the long ending. That is, we have, unlike most other manuscripts where we can basically try to figure out what they were doing when they when a variant came about, we can try to figure out where what was done to make the variant. This one is one of the few that we actually have a name associated with it. And it turns out that this Aristion is actually someone that we know from church history independent of this manuscript. Not only do we have a name, but we actually have a historical context in which to place him. We know of Aristion, at least from Eusebius. There might be a few other sources that talk about him. Eusebius would probably be the most detailed and also one of the most accurate. And Eusebius talks about him in his church history, his Historia Ecclesiastica, book 3, section 39. And based on what Eusebius says about Aristion, it actually isn't altogether unlikely that he is actually the author of the long ending. It actually really does make sense. That is, Aristion is associated with what are called the Apostolic Fathers. They were not apostles themselves. They were not people who were writing New Testament books, but they're called Apostolic Fathers because these are the people who were in the generation immediately following that of the apostles. So they're in the age that is right after the New Testament age. Okay, so that they're earliest witnesses who are not actually biblical witnesses. And when you read through the accounts of Aristion, he's actually included in the material on Papias and Eusebius. So Eusebius is actually primarily talking about Papias, but he winds up mentioning Aristion and a few other people in there. They're all associated together. And he's in particular associated with a fellow by the name of Justus, who you know from the Bible. He was the other guy who was a candidate for replacing Judas Iscariot. That is, in the book of Acts at the beginning, the 11 disciples, because Judas has killed himself, the 11 disciples decide that they need to have a replacement. And they basically draw lots. And the lot goes to Matthias instead of to Justus. Justus was the other candidate. And there's a story about Justus that circulated early on in the church about him swallowing deadly poison and yet surviving. And as far as we can tell, based on what Eusebius says, Aristion would have known of this story. Whether the story was accurate or not, we don't know. It's not mentioned in the Bible. It's not mentioned in any super authoritative source. But it's a story, at least, that Aristion would have been aware of. Now, there is no good reason to believe that Aristion actually knew the biblical authors in any personal way. If he did know them, it would have been only in a passing way. But he would have at least known of this story. And so it's interesting that this particular detail, drinking the deadly poison and yet surviving, is actually talked about in Mark 16:18. But you don't find it anywhere in the New Testament. And that's because, as far as we can tell, it doesn't come from the New Testament. It comes from this external story about Justus. But that being said, this is still speculative. Okay, we don't absolutely know that it was Aristion who came up with the long ending. That's what the Armenian manuscript attributes. In the Armenian manuscripts, as far as versions, other than the Greek, the Armenian manuscripts are easily the best. They're the king of the versions. But what we still need to bear in mind, though, is even if it was Aristion, we still have the problem of Aristion not being apostolic in the sense of giving scripture. That is, there is no evidence that he was either an apostle, he certainly was an apostle, or that he was commissioned by an apostle. Okay, for example, Peter gives his commission to Paul when he references Paul's work as being scripture. I believe that's in 2 Peter. You have that kind of commission where it said, yes, this person is a scripture writer, and I, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, one of the 12, one of the those selected to be his legal representative, can attest to that. You have that for Paul. You also have implicit reference for that for Luke, because Luke is actually associated with the eyewitnesses. He knew these people personally. And of course, Paul actually quotes Luke, and Peter okays Paul. So those kinds of things are, there's this chain of custody and chain of command that happens with Paul and Luke. But you don't have that with Aristion. Aristion is never mentioned as being an authorized author of Scripture. What he did, he appears to have done on his own. It wasn't at the command of Peter, it wasn't at the command of Mark, it wasn't command of any of these people. It seems to have been something that he took upon himself to do. Okay. Now, was it necessarily bad? No, not necessarily. Like I said, a lot of the long ending of Mark actually comes from other places in the Bible, so the vast majority of it you wouldn't consider to be anti-biblical. The problem is that it just simply isn't original. And because of that, it's not canonical. It's not authoritative in the same way that the truly biblical material is. All right, so that is a very long discussion for a very interesting variant. I hope that you guys have been able to get something out of this and see how textual criticism gets lived out in detail. For those of you who are in Christ, I pray that you would go with God and be blessed. But for those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.